The gym was buzzing with the clank of weights and the grunts of fighters when suddenly a loud voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you! Plain Jane in the corner. Want to spar with me?" Everyone froze. All eyes turned to Jake, the black belt champion, his muscles bulging under his tight shirt, a cocky grin plastered on his face. He pointed at Lila, a quiet woman in a baggy sweatshirt, wiping down a treadmill in the corner. Her hair was tied in a messy bun, and she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The gym went silent, waiting for her response. Jake laughed, expecting her to back down, but Lila's eyes locked onto his. Without a word, she stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking on the mat. The crowd gasped as she nodded, her face calm but her eyes burning with something nobody could name. Jake's grin faltered for a split second. What was she doing? Was she crazy? The referee, unsure, called them to the sparring ring. As Lila stepped in, her small frame dwarfed by Jake's towering build, the gym held its breath. Then, in a flash, Lila moved faster than anyone expected. Her fist flew toward Jake's face, stopping an inch from his nose. The gym went dead silent. What just happened? How did she move like that? And why was Jake, the unbeatable black belt, frozen in place? The story rewinds to earlier that day. Lila wasn't the kind of person you'd notice. She came to the gym every evening, always in the same oversized sweatshirt, cleaning equipment or stretching quietly in the corner. Nobody knew much about her. She wasn't a fighter, or so everyone thought. She kept to herself, her brown eyes scanning the room like she was studying something no one else could see. The regulars, a mix of bodybuilders and martial artists, barely gave her a second glance. To them, she was just the cleaning lady, or that quiet girl. But Lila wasn't there to make friends. She had her reasons for showing up, reasons she kept locked deep inside. Jake, on the other hand, was the gym's king. A black belt in karate, he'd won every local tournament for 3 years straight. He loved the attention, flexing for the crowd and tossing out cocky jokes. That day, he was in a mood. He'd just beaten another challenger in a sparring match, and the cheers weren't enough. He wanted more. His eyes landed on Lila, mopping the floor near the lockers. She looked like an easy target, someone to make the crowd laugh. "Let's have some fun," he muttered to his buddies, who snickered. He strutted over, calling her out in front of everyone. It was supposed to be a joke. He didn't expect her to say yes. The tension in the gym started small, like a spark. People whispered as Lila set down her mop. "Is she serious?" one guy muttered. "She's gonna get crushed," said another. Jake's friends laughed, egging him on. But Lila didn't flinch. She walked to the ring like she'd done it 100 times before. Nobody knew what to think. Was she clueless, brave, or something else entirely? The referee, a grizzled old man named Coach Harris, hesitated. "Lila, you sure about this?" he asked quietly. She just nodded, her face unreadable. Jake cracked his knuckles, grinning again, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Something about Lila's calmness unnerved him. As they faced off, the crowd formed a tight circle around the ring. Jake bounced on his toes, throwing fake jabs to show off. Lila stood still, her hands loose at her sides. The bell rang. Jake lunged, aiming a playful kick at her leg, expecting her to stumble. But Lila moved like lightning. In one smooth step, she dodged, her body flowing like water. Before anyone could blink, her fist was up, stopping just shy of Jake's face. The gym went quiet as a graveyard. Jake's eyes widened, his bravado gone. Lila lowered her hand, stepping back, her face still calm. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer or gasp. Coach Harris's jaw dropped. Who was this woman? And what was she hiding? The moment hung in the air, heavy with questions. Jake tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. Lila didn't say a word. She just stood there, waiting for his next move. The gym was a powder keg, ready to explode. What would Jake do? Would he back down, or would he push harder? And what was Lila's secret? Nobody could look away. The gym was still frozen, every eye glued to the sparring ring where Lila stood, calm as a pond, while Jake's face twitched with confusion. Her fist, stopping an inch from his nose, had shaken him. The crowd murmured, their whispers like static in the air. Did you see that? How'd she move so fast? Jake's buddies, usually loud and rowdy, stood quiet, their smirks gone. Lila's eyes stayed locked on Jake, steady and unblinking, like she could see right through him. The referee, Coach Harris, cleared his throat trying to break the tension. Round 1, folks. Let's keep it clean, he called, but his voice wavered. Nobody knew what was coming next, least of all Jake. Rewind to a few hours before the challenge. Lila had arrived at the gym at her usual time, just as the sun dipped low, painting the windows orange. She carried a small duffel bag, worn and faded, and wore her usual baggy sweatshirt. She moved like a shadow, unnoticed by the sweaty fighters and clanging weights. But today, something was different. As she wiped down the benches, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. She glanced at the sparring ring, her eyes lingering on the faded mat. Nobody knew it, but Lila had stood in a ring like that before years ago, in a different life. Back then, Lila wasn't plain Jane. She was someone else, someone fierce. She trained in a small dojo far from this city, under a teacher who saw something special in her. You've got fire in you, kid, he'd said, his voice gruff but kind. Lila had been a teenager, small but scrappy, learning moves that made her feel invincible. She'd loved the rhythm of it dodging, striking, flowing like a river, but something happened, something that made her walk away from that life. She never talked about it, not even to herself. The gym was her quiet place now, a place to hide from the past, until Jake's voice had yanked her back. In the ring, Jake shook off his shock and forced a laugh. Nice trick, lady, he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. But this ain't a game. He cracked his neck, trying to regain his swagger. The crowd leaned in, sensing the tension spike. Jake was the champ, nobody beat him. Surely, this was just a fluke. Lila didn't respond. She just adjusted her stance, her feet light on the mat. Coach Harris signaled for the round to continue. Jake lunged again, faster this time, aiming a real kick at Lila's side. The crowd gasped, expecting her to crumple, but Lila sidestepped, her body twisting like she'd seen the move coming a mile away. She didn't strike back, she just moved, her steps so smooth they looked like a dance. The gym buzzed with whispers. Who is she? Where'd she learn that? Jake's face reddened. He wasn't used to being dodged, especially not by someone like her. He threw a flurry of punches, each one sharp and fast, meant to overwhelm her, but Lila weaved through them, her body bending and swaying, never once getting hit. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Jake's buddies started to fidget. One of them, a lanky guy named Mike, muttered, "This ain't right. She's got to be cheating or something." But Coach Harris watched closely, his eyes narrowing. He'd seen moves like Lila's before, long ago, in a tournament he'd never forget. Lila's past was a locked box, but cracks were starting to show. She hadn't fought in years, not since the day everything changed. She'd sworn she'd never step into a ring again. Yet here she was, facing a black belt who thought she was a joke. Why didn't she back down? Maybe it was the way Jake laughed, like she was nothing. Maybe it was the crowd stares, reminding her of the eyes that used to cheer her on. Or maybe, deep down, the fire her old teacher saw was still burning. Jake was getting mad now. His punches grew wilder, his breath heavy. Lila stayed calm, dodging every blow with ease. Then, in a split second, she shifted. Her hand shot out, not to hit, but to grab Jake's wrist mid-punch. She twisted, just enough to throw him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell. The gym went quiet again, the air thick with shock. Jake's eyes burned with something new anger, mixed with fear. Lila let go and stepped back, her face still unreadable. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer or stay silent. Coach Harris blew his whistle, ending the round. "Take a break," he barked, but his eyes stayed on Lila. He knew something the others didn't. He'd seen a fighter like her before, someone who moved like a ghost. But that fighter had disappeared years ago, after a tragedy nobody talked about anymore. Was Lila her, or was this just a coincidence? Jake stormed to his corner, his chest heaving. Lila walked to hers, her steps slow and deliberate. The crowd whispered, their questions growing louder. Who was this woman? And what would happen in the next round? The gym was a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation as the crowd pressed closer to the sparring ring. Jake paced in his corner, his face flushed, sweat dripping from his brow. He shot glares at Lila, who stood quietly in her corner, her hands loose, her eyes distant but sharp. The silence from her was deafening, unnerving everyone, especially Jake. His buddies whispered nervously, their confidence in their champion crumbling. "She's got to be faking it," Mike muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Coach Harris, the referee, stood between them, his weathered face tense. He'd seen something in Lila's move, something that stirred a memory he couldn't shake. The bell for the second round was about to ring, and nobody could predict what would happen next. Earlier that day, before Jake's challenge, Lila had sat alone in the gym's locker room, staring at her duffel bag. Inside was a small, folded piece of clotha worn-out belt, not black, but red, with faded gold stitching. It was from her old life, the one she'd buried. She hadn't touched it in years, but today, she'd brought it with her, like a ghost she couldn't outrun. She'd been a prodigy once, trained by a master who called her his little dragon. But a single night had changed everything. A fight gone wrong, a promise broken, a heart shattered. She'd walked away, vowing never to fight again. Yet here she was, pulled back into the ring by Jake's mocking voice. Something inside her had snapped, not in anger, but in resolve. She wasn't fighting for herself, she was fighting for the girl she used to be. Back in the ring, the bell rang. Jake charged like a bull, his fists flying, determined to end this embarrassment. The crowd gasped, expecting Lila to crumble under his fury, but she didn't. Her body moved like a shadow, slipping past every punch, every kick, with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. Jake's frustration boiled over. "Stand still!" he roared, throwing a wild hook. Lila ducked, her hair slipping free from its bun, falling around her shoulders like a dark curtain. For a moment, she looked different, fiercer, like someone else entirely. The crowd murmured, sensing the shift. Jake's buddies stopped joking. Even Mike, usually loud, was silent, his eyes wide. Then it happened. Jake lunged, aiming a powerful kick at Lila's ribs. She didn't dodge this time. Instead, she stepped in, catching his leg under her arm. In one fluid motion, she twisted, using his momentum to flip him onto the mat. The gym erupted in gasps. Jake hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out. Lila didn't stop there. She stepped back, her stance low, her eyes locked on him. "Get up," she said softly, her first words since the fight began. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. Jake scrambled to his feet, his face a mix of shock and rage. The crowd was on edge, their whispers turning to shouts. "What was that? Did she just?" Coach Harris's eyes narrowed. He knew that move. It was rare, taught only by a handful of masters. He'd seen it years ago in a tournament where a young girl had stunned everyone until she vanished after a tragedy. Could Lila be her? He shook his head, trying to focus. Jake, now desperate, rushed at Lila again, throwing everything he had. But Lila was untouchable. She parried his strikes, her movements precise, almost effortless. Each dodge was a statement, each step a memory of who she'd been. The crowd could feel it, something bigger was unfolding. Then, a twist. Jake, panting and wild-eyed, faked a punch and grabbed Lila's wrist, yanking her forward. The crowd gasped, thinking he'd finally caught her. For a moment, it looked like he had the upper hand. He smirked, raising his fist for a crushing blow, but Lila's eyes flashed. In a blur, she twisted free, her body spinning like a top. Her legs swept low, knocking Jake's feet out from under him. He crashed to the mat again, harder this time. The gym went silent, the kind of silence that hurts your ears. Lila stood over him, her chest rising and falling, her face unreadable. Jake didn't move. He just stared up at her, his bravado gone, replaced by something like fear. Coach Harris stepped forward, his whistle forgotten. "Enough!" he barked, but his eyes were on Lila. The crowd was frozen, their cheers stuck in their throats. Jake's buddies looked like they'd seen a ghost. Lila stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides. She didn't look at Jake or the crowd. She just turned and walked toward her corner, her steps slow, like she was carrying something heavy. The gym was a storm of questions. Who was she? How did she do that? And why did Jake, the unbeatable black belt, look so small? As Lila reached her corner, she paused, her hand brushing the edge of her sweatshirt. For a split second, the fabric shifted, revealing a glimpse of something red underneath a belt, hidden from view. Coach Harris's breath caught. He knew that belt. He knew what it meant. The crowd didn't notice, but he did. And as Lila turned to face the ring again, her eyes met his. In that moment, he was sure the little dragon was back. But what would she do next? The gym was a cauldron of whispers. Every eye fixed on Lila as she stood in her corner, her face still a mask of calm. Jake, sprawled on the mat, scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with something new panic. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of awe and disbelief. "She took him down twice," a woman whispered. "Who is she?" a guy muttered nearby. Coach Harris stood frozen, his whistle dangling from his hand. That red belt he'd glimpsed under Lila's sweatshirt burned in his mind. He'd seen it before years ago on a girl who'd been unstoppable until she wasn't. The bell for the third round hadn't rung yet, but the tension was suffocating. Lila's past was clawing its way to the surface, and the gym was about to explode. Earlier that morning, Lila had sat in the locker room, her fingers brushing the red belt in her bag. She hadn't planned to fight today or ever again. The belt was a relic of a life she'd left behind, a life of sweat and triumph, but also pain. Her old teacher's voice echoed in her head. "You're a dragon, Lila. Don't let the fire die." But the fire had died, or so she thought, after that night years ago fight that ended in blood and guilt. She'd moved to this city to start over, to be invisible. Cleaning the gym was her way of staying close to the world she'd loved without touching it. But Jake's taunt had been a spark, and now the fire was burning again, whether she wanted it or not. In the ring, Jake wiped the sweat from his face, his hands shaking. He couldn't lose to her, not to some nobody. His buddies shouted from the sidelines, "Come on, Jake, show her." But their voices were hollow. Jake glanced at them, then at Lila, who hadn't moved, her eyes locked on the mat like she was seeing something else. Coach Harris stepped forward, his voice low. "Lila, you good to continue?" She nodded, but her jaw tightened. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. The bell rang. Jake didn't rush this time. He circled her, cautious now, his ego bruised, but his mind sharp. Lila mirrored him, her steps light, her body loose. The gym was so quiet you could hear their sneakers squeak. Jake feinted left, then threw a low kick, testing her. Lila sidestepped, but this time, she counterate a quick jab to Jake's chest. Not hard, but precise. He stumbled back, gasping. The crowd gasped too, their excitement spiking. Jake growled, lunging with a flurry of punches, but Lila danced through them, her movements a blur. Then, in a heartbeat, she struck a spinning kick that grazed Jake's shoulder, sending him spinning. He didn't fall, but he wobbled, his face pale. The crowd erupted, cheers mixing with shouts of shock. "She's unreal!" someone yelled. Jake's buddies looked sick, their jaws slack. Coach Harris's eyes widened, he knew that kick. It was her signature move, the one that had won her a championship before she vanished. He stepped closer to the ring, his heart pounding. "Lila," he whispered, too low for anyone to hear. She didn't look at him, but her shoulders tensed, like she felt his gaze. Jake, desperate, tried one last trick. He faked a stumble, then launched a surprise uppercut, aiming for Lila's chin. The crowd held its breath, sure she'd be caught. But Lila leaned back, the punch missing by inches. In that split second, she grabbed Jake's arm, twisted, and flipped him over her hip. He hit the mat with a thud that echoed through the gym. This time, he didn't get up right away. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving. The crowd was silent again, the weight of the moment crushing. Lila stepped back, her breath steady, but her eyes flickered with something pain, maybe, or regret. Coach Harris blew his whistle, ending the round. "That's it," he shouted, but his voice cracked. He walked to the center, his eyes on Lila. The crowd started to whisper again, louder now. Questions flying. Is she a pro? Where did she learn that? Jake's buddies were silent, their faces pale. Jake rolled to his knees, his head down, humiliated. Lila turned to leave the ring, but Coach Harris grabbed her arm gently. "Lila," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "It's you, isn't it? The Dragon of Dawson's dojo." The gym went dead quiet. Every head snapped to Lila. Her eyes widened, just for a second, before she pulled her arm free. She didn't answer. She just walked toward the locker room, her steps heavy. The crowd parted, staring. Jake looked up, his face a mix of shame and confusion. Coach Harris stood frozen, his words hanging in the air. The red belt under Lila's sweatshirt was hidden again, but the truth was out. The little dragon was reeling. She wasn't done yet.